Hello everybody and welcome to my channel. Today is that time of the year where I need to talk about WWDC, which is coming very soon. So as every year I'm gonna have a quick talk about my expectations from it, what I would like to see, kind of my wishes. You know, the typical thing that everybody talks during this time. I've been doing it for a while now, so it was kind of a tradition that I couldn't miss. In all honesty, I had a hard time because at the beginning I thought, well, maybe there is not much things that I'm expecting. There is not many wishes that I have. And that's mainly because for a long time I've been kind of like more interested and, that thing that tickles me. It's more Swift, the programming language and kind of the tools and all stuff that comes through that, to be honest, more than actually the product of iOS, like the features of iOS and all the stuff that are more user facing. I'm not too excited about that, to be honest. So I actually felt that I didn't have much to expect. Mainly because the bigger things, in my opinion, are coming through Swift and Swift Evolution, and that's open source. So there is not much that Apple can reveal there that we didn't know about. Maybe they have something that they have been working on public, but that will feel very weird and kind of like the previous times something like that has happened. People didn't like it very much, so I hope they don't do it again. So that was my first impressions. But then I kept thinking, it's like, oh wait, maybe there are things that I just keep waiting and maybe they don't happen, so that's why I kind of don't think about them. But then Google I/O happened, and there was one super cool thing that I'm not sure if I'm expecting, and I don't think that Apple is gonna do it at all, but I think it's worth talking about, which is system-wide UI theming. Right now we have a dark and light themes, like they are called modes, but like they are basically two different themes that we can change or device. And the thing here is that affects all the apps, system applications and third-party applications. It affects everything on the system. Google revealed the Material U, which is Material is basically their theming system, their UI toolkit, basically. So now they are releasing this version that basically allows the user to change the theme, and that affects the entire system, including third-party APIs. It's no longer light and dark. Now it can be every color and every combination of colors. And that's, when I first saw it, it was like kind of scary. Like, who will want these colors on all the applications? And from the point of view of the developer or designer, it's like now your color palette, it's useless because the user can change it at any point. But the more I look at it and the more I think, when Apple released the widgets, and people went crazy because there are some well-known applications from well-known developers that basically let you put kind of customizable widgets, although the data sources are always the same, but the style of the clock or the style of the calendar, and people likes that a lot, or putting a picture and stuff like that. That was huge. TikTok, Instagram, everything, everybody was talking about that, about the fact that now you could customize your iPhone. It was a combination of the widgets with the trick that on shortcuts you can put icons that trigger applications, so people was customizing the application icons. So people really wants to see something to customize their devices, and that's not new, like that's always been the case. Just that on iOS we have been always very restricted. So given that Google did this, I honestly think that this can be one of the biggest selling points for Android right now if iOS doesn't do something similar. You never know, so maybe that's the thing. I guess that's kind of like my wish, expectation, hope. I don't know exactly what it is, but that's the first thing I started thinking about. But then we switch into a more technical thing. There has been something that for a while people has been kind of like talking, but it's not even like a rumor. Like, it's just like people hopes, to be honest, which at the first glance it may seem that, well, that's just a smoke. It's never gonna happen. It's just people hopes. But we have to remember that that's exactly what happened with SwiftUI. With SwiftUI, it was just hopes. And I'm one of the first ones that really wanted SwiftUI to exist. And I keep wishing for it, but it never happened. And I didn't expect Apple to do it until they did it. For me, it was one of the biggest things. It was one of the biggest, actually, hits on this channel, like the first video I recorded after the announcement. It was like dark, the light was crap, but it was the first video on YouTube to talk about SwiftUI, and it was a hit for me. So the same thing can happen now with another layer of our application architecture, the data layer. So I'm obviously talking about a database. We have core data, which has been battle tested over years, and it does many things, but it doesn't really feel at home with Swift. Mainly you want your models to be value types. And core data, and not only core data, like all the other database frameworks like Realm, like all those things don't really match what a modern concept of a database is. Mainly because it's what I consider a polluting framework. And it's a very bad polluting framework in my opinion. Both Realm, core data, all of them have the same issues, which is that they force their superclasses or whatever they are into your models. And I feel like very bad because at the end, and you will say, well, you shouldn't expose those things into your application, so you should just use them to get things from the database and then convert them into your models, DTOs, Java, pure objects, whatever you want to call them. But then I would say, then what's the point of that framework? Honestly, what's the point? Like if you look at core data, if you look at Realm, the biggest thing that they add, it's not the persistence. What they really add, nice thing that from anywhere you can fetch your database and get live updates and all that cool stuff, that sometimes they force you into their superclasses, as I said. If you don't use that, for example, on core data, if you don't use the NSFetch resource controller, what are you doing? And if you switch into your own objects, you cannot use that. So there has been all this kind of mixed message of, yes, it's a polluting framework, that's what I call them, because if you want to profit from it fully, you need to use them everywhere and let them pollute your entire code base. And if you don't do that, then you lose a lot of their functionality. I still think core data is nice because it's nice, like the interface and all that stuff. It's very nice, but honestly, I've never been happy just letting that framework pollute everything. So what will something more modern look like in Swift? Well, it's value types for sure. I still think it should be baked by SQLite because that's basically the standard. It's super battle tested. There is no problems with that. Everyone knows how to do it. But then I start thinking, well, we already have that, honestly. Like we have this library, which it's been like going for a while now. And if you use it, you're gonna fall immediately in love with it because it's basically, it doesn't pretend to be super huge like core data, but honestly, it still has all the functionality that you need and in a much simpler way. It's like just protocols that your models can conform to, so you don't have to inherit from their things if you don't want to. You can have value types and you can still use the features that all those other frameworks provide, which is like live updates and all that stuff. Honestly, nowadays, that's my go-to in terms of database storage. Is Apple working on something similar? I don't know. But definitely, I think it's time for a new refresh on the model layer of our applications. And having now the UI fully modern, it probably would be nice to have like a database fully modern. There is another point where it's like, well, what do we have in the middle? And it's like kind of like the controller layer, but with SwiftUI, that's already kind of solved, but I will still like to see some improvements in that aspect. I'm gonna talk about SwiftUI, of course, but that's gonna be in a bit. For now though, let's switch gears and let's talk about the tools. What's my biggest wish? It's everything related to Xcode. And no, I'm not talking about Xcode for iPad. I guess that would be nice, but honestly, I don't really even want to see it, If that comes because they are doing bigger things on iPad and they are making like a full refresh of the iPad, which I think that's kind of crazy. But if that comes as a benefit of now the app is multi-platform somehow, fine. If they take the Swift playgrounds and they can improve them a little bit, that's fine too. But I don't really think that nobody should focus on building an Xcode for iPad fully experience yet, I think it's going to be very important because otherwise you cannot say that iPad is a computing platform if you cannot develop on it. I completely agree with that. It's just that I'm a little bit selfish and I prefer that effort to be put on the tools I use every day. So what they should be improving? Overall, performance, stability, all the stuff, like all the things that we know that Xcode should improve. But more concretely, I think that we need to have a more polished Swift package management integration on Xcode. It's good and it works very well, but there are some rough edges. Like, for example, the other day I was mentioning on Twitter that if it seems like if you have the same dependency on different packages, the same project, and one dependency ends with that Git and the other doesn't, that basically confuses Xcode. Some other things like creating a file in a package, it does the header just always says file.swift, and that's you manually need to rename it. At the point that we are, these things shouldn't happen. So I hope they kind of like put more effort, and in the next version of Xcode all of this is more polished. But kind of the other thing I'm hoping is that we can read completely of the project file. And that seems insane, but honestly, I think that just technical debt. It's a huge pile of technical debt that doesn't add very much nowadays. So what would I like to see instead? Probably just, expand the package.swift. Maybe if you want, make another similar thing, but I will argue like why. But expand that to just support the things that doesn't support yet, and that's pretty much it. If you want to keep a project file, that's for keeping things like the themes and maybe the provisioning profiles and that kind of configuration, that's fine. But for everything else, a package file is much, much better. It's much easier to manage and it causes a lot less problems. And if you look at the reality, well, since Pointfree, and I'm gonna leave a link on the description as always because I love everything they do, but since Pointfree released Ice Awards, the game that it's open source, if you look at it, it's amazing because yes, of course, there is an Xcode project because there is an alternative. But if you look at the project, it's literally just an app delegate, and that's it. The entire project is built and kept into different packages. Everything you do to manage your project, it's on packages. It's already on package.swift. And then you just have to, for now, there is an alternative, so you have to put Xcode on top of it with some configurations, entitlements, and all that stuff, But that's kind of like the direction I'm moving all my apps into. I would like to see something like that, kind of become more official on Apple development platforms. But of course, you know what will be even better than that? That the IDE was open source and that we could improve it and we could extend it with plugins and all these kind of things that all the other communities are used to. And we seem like we're stuck in this black hole where we cannot extend our tools, or it's very hard to extend our tools. Like, I'm very tired to have to deal with not being able to integrate processes into our tools. Yes, you can always put a build step, but that's the worst thing you can do. Like, that's just like a patch. Just recently, I spent a bunch of time actually moving things from our build phases into external tools that we could trigger manually, or we could build watchers on top of the file system, like all that kind of stuff. Why? Because when you start adding code generation, which the compiler should support, you start adding linting, which hopefully you could use with a plugin on the IDE like everywhere else. When you start adding formatter, the same thing. All these things start piling up the more rules you add it and the bigger your project is. And it gets to a point that it takes like seconds, like I'm talking about 14 seconds just to do all those steps every time you build, which is not necessary. You can make the build phases more complex and whatever you want, but like realistically, we're just working around a limitation of the IDE. There should be ways to have a proper plugin system and not the one that we currently have that allow us to do all of this, iterate on every time we save things happen, and that the IDE understands it so it doesn't freak out the compilation or lose the history, because that's what happens. If you modify a file from the outside, like you're formatting a file, your history on Xcode, it's gone. So, this thing needs to change. Yes, they could build a plugin system, but honestly, my wish, and it's not gonna happen, but I wish they were working in basically a rebrand of Xcode, built fully in Swift so people who could hack around with it easily, and fully open source. I think the SPM project has grown and has gotten where it is thanks to like being open source, being able for people to evolve it and propose things and all that stuff. And if that could happen with the tools, we could probably be in line with a lot of other ecosystems, which right now we are not. So that's one of my biggest hopes. And talking about Xcode, another thing related to tooling and Xcode that I really wish Apple released already it's basically a CI system. Since like last year or in the last few months, they changed the rules about how you can virtualize Mac OS, and all the CI providers are kind of like freaking out, and they are not really providing solutions for supporting new operating systems. The ones they are gonna make it super expensive. I mean, it's a big cloud at the moment. If you have it in house, good for you. If you're seeing one of these providers, if you're lucky, it's one of those ones that said, well, I'm not going to look at the rules because they are kind of ambiguous, so we're going to go for it. But right now, it's a mess everywhere. GitHub Actions are messed up. Circle CI doesn't know what to do. It's a whole mess. So, in my opinion, if Apple released an official Apple CI, maybe it could be free, we already pay for development, even if it's nothing, but, like it's all about the App Store and why we are developers and what are they giving to us? Well, maybe that 30% could be justified if they added more of these things. Who knows? But even if you had to pay, if it was a reasonable price and it was properly integrated and it worked, I think it will be worth it, because right now the whole CI situation is kind of a mess. But for the love of God, please, if Apple is thinking on that, please don't base it on Xcode bots. As I said, let's get rid of this Xcode project situation. Let's get rid, like Xcode bots is one of the biggest things I regret even like learning, because they never work. They were full of issues. The happiest moment in my life was when I got rid of completely of them, honestly. So I don't want an Apple CI that is built on that. I know it's one of these other things that it's never going to happen, but who knows? We're here to wish. Like when WWDC happens, reality is going to be here. So then we cannot do this anymore. But for now, let me wish, please. So now let's go back to SwiftUI and application and the architecture and stuff. One of the things that I kind of expect to see this year, it's more native Swift UIs, and I'm talking in two senses. Maybe like replace the implementation of some Swift UI views for a native implementation instead of relying on UIKit and AppKit under the hood. They do that for many things, but not for everything. So maybe it's time to start doing that. And in another sense, adding more views into SwiftUI, more default Apple-provided widgets or views, whatever you call them. And of course, improvements on the existing ones, things like keyboard handling or the freeze responder chain, like all that stuff. There are still missing pieces that force you to go back into UIKit and AppKit, which is pretty cool that you can do, but it feels like an all or nothing. And many times you still have to go to the nothing and re-implement it yourself, which doesn't feel good. I hope that this year, now that the foundations are there, I hope they kind of expand more in terms of providing more cool things for us. And again, related to the tooling, I really hope they kind of invest a little bit more on the tooling, because especially like things like what I'm seeing on Android, on the Android tools with Jetpack Compose, some of the stuff, it's very, very cool. Some of the things is the same thing we have, that's perfectly fine. But things like animations, where you can actually see the animation with a timeline and go back and forth and repeat it in a loop and stuff like that, that's super cool. And I wish we could do that with the previews, because right now the previews on Xcode, or they are static or they run an entire simulator. In another sense, I would also love to see a better solution for testing on SwiftUI. To be honest, it's not like I need it a lot, because in reality, I do a lot of things with the Composer architecture when I'm writing SwiftUI. So that kind of like already covers pretty much everything I want to test. But for the people that really wants to go and test the UI specifically, I think it's going to be very useful if Apple actually gives proper tooling integrated with Xcode and the previews and all the stuff to actually help with testability. And here, I think Google is already doing a better job with Jetpack Compose and some of the toolings around that. But I wouldn't stop there. I will go back to one of the wishes from previous years about navigation. I think it's time, and that's what I was talking about, like this middle layer, this controller layer. I don't expect Apple to give us something like the composable architecture, like a whole full architecture, even though all their documentation or the advice it's kind of tailored to that. It's basically telling us, yes, have a unidirectional data flow architecture, but the part about the architecture is like, yeah, we provide you these state objects, observable objects, and all that stuff, but it's like up to you, like do it however you want. If you have been looking at the recent series from Pointfree, I know I keep mentioning them because they are for me like the ones providing the most important things to the community right now. if you have been looking at that, like there is no solution to actually compose things on SwiftUI probably in terms of the architecture, the flow of data and all that stuff. It's very verbose. So maybe they're gonna give us something like that. I don't expect it to be a full architecture, but one thing I think definitely they need to give us, it's a solution integrated with tooling, like not only code but also tooling, that hopefully it's declarative and it's so as cool as SwiftUI is, for navigation integrated with universal links, for navigation integrated with push notifications payloads, all that stuff, you know? Like right now, there is a lot of ways to trigger the opening of an application and deep link into specific screens, but there is no official tooling for it. I don't think SwiftUI has a problem with that. I think that navigation on SwiftUI, it's fine, although it has, you know, some edge cases that they should fix, but that's just bugs. But in terms of the solution, I think SwiftUI it's fine. It's you have your state that describes the navigation and that drives the UI. That's perfectly fine. I just think that we should have tooling and maybe a little bit more help into declaring these routes and all that stuff, you know. That's something I keep hoping every year because I think it's a huge thing that any modern application should have, and there is no answer from Apple. So I hope they give us something. And to be honest, that's it. I could keep talking for ages, you know. I hope that we could have iCloud running Swift, basically Lambda functions, because, I mean, it's time for that. And I hope that we could have Swift core, what I keep talking Swift core, which is just let me embed the compiler or an interpreter into an application, and they could use that also for shortcuts to, instead of relying on JavaScript for anything, if we have this super cool language, why we cannot use it to drive, you know, interactive things in applications. That's things I keep wishing. Things are not happening, but, you know, as I said, now it's time for wishes. And when WWDC starts, it's time for reality. Here, all the things I kind of expect and wish to happen. Probably a lot of them are gonna stay in the wish list, and maybe we get some surprises. But tell me, what do you think? Leave me a comment down below with your wishes or your expectations and how real they are. You know what I mean? So that's it for today. Thank you all for watching and see you all next time.